Hey there everyone, I'm a Zelda fan, and a pretty big one at that. A lot of times I like to browse YouTube and check out Twilight Princess reviews. Not just Twilight Princess, but Zelda reviews in general, because I like to hear what other people think of the Zelda franchise and see if their thoughts align with my own. However, I've noticed a trend when clicking on Twilight Princess reviews and retrospectives. What is this trend, you may be asking yourself? The trend is an almighty view of the series' current producer, E.G. Aonuma. Specifically, the videos will talk about how Aonuma did not want to make Twilight Princess, because he was not interested in a dark and mature Zelda title. They will not speak of this in a merely neutral manner. They will usually say this in a way as defending Aonuma, as though Aonuma is a creative spark of game design, and he was forced to change his vision in order to please the mindless fan base and the greedy corporate shareholders. Here's a classic example of a YouTube review of Twilight Princess that does what I'm referring to.
Ask developers about this game, and you will get a very different opinion. You see, Twilight Princess is one of the weirdest games in the entire series, because it was the only one that was a test tube baby, incubated out of sheer desperation in this Hail Mary last-ditch attempt to save the franchise from winding up in the same time corner as the Metroid series. This wasn't just a simple correction from the Wind Waker. This is the developers deliberately sacrificing every single core value they've had in the franchise for decades in an attempt to somehow reclaim a bit of the magic and charm and sales of Ocarina of Time.
Uh-oh. Pretty horroring stuff. Aonuma had to replace his vision of a Wind Waker sequel with a realistic Zelda to get the sales up and hopefully keep the franchise alive. Well, at least he decided to be a hero about it and do the best with what work was given to him. After all, it's not his fault that Twilight Princess has a lot of shortcomings. It's the fans' fault, for not buying Wind Waker because they judged it based on its graphics. Well, that's the story that these reviewers always tend to tell on YouTube. You could say it's the Twilight Princess consensus. But there's just one detail they leave out. One minuscule part of the story you think at least one of them would have pointed out by now. He went missing halfway through development. You may be wondering how I came across this elusive piece of forbidden knowledge, this top secret, never discussed part of Twilight's development. Well, I went to the Wikipedia page and read the development category. Yeah, that's all I did. Even checked the source too. I had to use the internet Wayback Machine. Well, let's read together, shall we? I had no doubt that this was the right direction to pursue, and having to set the framework of this new direction my work was required on another project, I left the realistic Zelda team. And then he later goes on to say, in hindsight, by immersing myself in the Minish Cap project, I gave myself a way to escape from not being able to find a breakthrough on the realistic Zelda project. I regret that I might have been too selfish, thinking that I could just leave my staff to come up with a solution, but my mistaken thinking caught up with me. So to quickly summarize, Miyamoto ordered Aonuma and his team to make sure Twilight Princess had something to separate itself from being next-gen Ocarina of Time. They came up with Wolf Link and a parallel world, but struggled to implement these ideas into the game. So Aonuma decided to do what all people in positions of power should do when faced with a challenge to overcome. He bolted to the nearest door and didn't look back. So Aonuma left the team to figure out what to do on their own. Well, I guess you can make the argument that it's not really his fault that he had to leave halfway during development. He didn't want to make a realistic Zelda in the first place. If only those darn Zelda fans hadn't been asking for a realistic Zelda and just put up with his cel-shaded Zelda, he would be in a better position. He could have made Wind Waker 2, cleaned up Wind Waker, and I'm sure he would have had ideas flowing. But instead, he was tasked with making a game that he didn't really want to, and so he didn't know what to do about it, so he just abandoned the realistic Zelda to go work on the Toon Link game, Minish Cap, with Capcom instead. I guess you can make that argument, but what is important to know is that there was a tech demo in 2000 revealed for the Nintendo GameCube, and it showed demos of different type of games that would come out on the system, and most of the demos showed a realistic depiction of what the games would become, but in particular there was a demo of Link and Ganondorf fighting one another, and that demo would never become realized. It would turn into Wind Waker. This is because Aonuma did not like the graphics of the tech demo. In fact, he commented that he hated it and considered it derivative. Now it all circles back to my point at the start of the video. Are the YouTube reviewers right when they try to revise history and say the Wind Waker haters were the ones in the wrong? Should the fanbase just got over the fact that they were teased with a realistic depiction of a GameCube Zelda title and just get over the fact that the Wind Waker's art style is completely different to what they were expected? Personally, I believe the fans do have a right to be upset. The Zelda series up to this point had been getting progressively darker, with Ocarina and Majora being the darkest titles in the franchise yet. I'd like to present two arguments for why going with bright cartoony graphics was a bad choice for Wind Waker. The first argument is Nintendo already has enough cartoony franchises as is. Especially at the time of the GameCube, a lot of Nintendo fans accused Nintendo of going kiddie, as Nintendo's competitors were releasing mature titles like Halo and God of War. I'm not saying Zelda needed to be rated M, or to contain extreme amounts of violence and gore, but changing the art style so drastically does make the franchise more kiddie, and honestly could have been a part of the reason the GameCube didn't sell so well, as it alienated a lot of the older fan base. I myself was one of those people who skipped Wind Waker during the initial release, and would not play it until the Wii U version. And yes, a part of the reason I skipped the initial release of Wind Waker was because I didn't like the graphics. I am now convinced that Wind Waker is a masterpiece of a Zelda title, but I'm still not convinced the art style was the right move. Some people argue that Wind Waker's art style was a smart decision because it helped the visuals age better. I still disagree with that sentiment. Not only are there realistic titles on the GameCube that hold up well visually, like the two Metroid Prime games, but even Wind Waker's water, which is a huge chunk of the game's map, looks especially plain and average compared to Super Mario Sunshine's water. Now on to my second argument. For anyone who approves of Zelda not making realistic graphics in Wind Waker, or just not making realistic graphics anymore in general, I have a thought experiment for you. Take any large dark franchise today with an upcoming sequel, like Metroid Prime 4 or Elden Ring 2, and they show a trailer hyping up the game as depicting a realistic art style similar to the previous games in the series. And then, closer to the release date, all of a sudden, the graphics have now changed, and it looks completely cartoonish and childish. Would you be okay with that? Or better yet, would you be able to at least understand some people that are upset with the graphical changes? Now, I understand that the tech demo wasn't an official trailer, but Luigi's Mansion and Metroid Prime that were featured in the tech demo looked almost exactly as the actual games that would eventually release. While Wind Waker looks so different from the tech demo, it feels like a different franchise altogether. From the point of view of the fanbase, it felt like a complete bait and switch. What reason would the fanbase have at that time period to expect the next Zelda game to be so outlandishly cartoonish? It came out of seemingly nowhere and people were simply not impressed. Now, if you were watching any other YouTube video about Twilight, you could bet your bottom dollar they would say something along the lines of, well, Nintendo was inspired to make a cartoony art style, so that's what they went with. And then they would meander about something about core values, or they've been doing this for decades, and I'm here to tell you that's all baloney. Nintendo is not an omnipotent being in the sky that throws Zelda games down to the earth every 5 or 6 years. It's a business, and in that business, a team of people who create video games. And this particular game's sole director was Eiji Aonuma, who is a relatively new kid on the block of making Zelda titles. Let's go over a quick history lesson. Aonuma's first work on the Zelda series will be with Ocarina of Time, where he was one of the 5 directors of that game. Aonuma was in charge of the Dungeons of Ocarina, which all were really good, so props to him for that. The next title he would work on would be Majora's Mask, where he would be a co-director with Yoshiaki Koizumi. Now, I'm not going to get into it in this video, but basically Koizumi came up with most of the ideas for Majora's Mask, and I'd be willing to bet if it wasn't for Koizumi, Majora would have been another Twilight Princess, as in full of new ideas or mechanics that aren't particularly well thought out or fully realized. So then we get to Wind Waker, where Aonuma lands his first role as the sole director of a Zelda title. This is his first Zelda title where he cannot rely so much on the talent of others. This game is his vision more than Ocarina or Majora were. And how does he do? Surprisingly, Wind Waker excels at what it wants to be. A game about sailing around a large ocean and exploring whatever island, submarine, or lookout platform the player may spot. Wind Waker has some issues, most of which would be later fixed in the Wii U version, but it has a heart and soul. Like Majora, it had ideas, and it went all in on it. So in terms of game design, Aonuma is no amateur. The dude clearly knows his stuff. However, this is where the gloves come off. This is only his third Zelda game and his first director position by himself, and yet he is already causing major controversy. The 2000 Space World tech demo showcased many major Nintendo franchises, but it was the Link and Ganondorf battle that received the most attention. People were extremely excited, with IGN going as far as writing an article saying even though they knew it was merely a presentation thrown together at the last minute, the demo can only be considered the unofficial sequel in the Legend of Zelda franchise. But yet, Aonuma hated it, and ironically said it looks nothing like Zelda, despite it looking very similar to the previous two games in the franchise, whereas his art style looks nothing like any game in the franchise at this point. Now here's the thing, I do not believe he has been with the franchise long enough to give him the right to make such a drastic change to the franchise. It's not like the other YouTube reviewers' videos want you to believe, where they conveniently say, this is what Nintendo wanted. No, this is what Aonuma wanted. It's not like he's the one who put Zelda on the map. It's not like he's the creator of the Zelda franchise. That would be Shigeru Miyamoto, and surprise, surprise, Miyamoto was not a fan of the art style either. Aonuma intentionally postponed showing how development was going to Miyamoto because he knew Miyamoto would disapprove. When Miyamoto finally saw the art style, he apparently cringed. He made jokes about giving Toon Link the ability to fire lasers out of his eyes because of how large they were. I bring all this up to emphasize my point. It wasn't a small, closed-minded group of Zelda fans who whined about cartoony graphics like people want to parrot over and over again. Instead, it was Aonuma whining over the tech demographics that everyone else loved, and changing it just because he hated it, even to the dismay of the fanbase and gaming journalists, and even Miyamoto himself.